Yeah. Hi everyone. Welcome to today's session. We have Samaher Yehya today talking to us about the values and morals associated with the intention to join that influence the collective action participation. So as far as I could find out on the net, so you have finished your master's program in Social and Behavior Sciences in Tilburg University. So welcome to our session. And today it's a very interesting study using mixed method, both interviews and quantitative work on understanding the way in which people might join in collective action. And I think this is the study, in particular in the Netherlands context, where you're looking into the Palestinian solidarity groups. So that's so very much looking forward to hear your study. And the way it works, so Samaha is going to present her talk for about 10-15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion a discussion. So that's how it works. So if you have questions, please write it down, and then you can ask after the presentation. Great. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will start sharing. I need a request. I've sent it.
Oh, so yeah. So I think you can have a share
Okay.
your.
Yeah, perfect. Can everyone see the screen right now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. First of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you to everyone who organized this. As we've mentioned, my presentation today will be my thesis work on morals and community as vital influences on collective action in light of repression among young adults in the Netherlands. I will start with a brief background. I will overview the literature that helped me with this research. I will then present briefly my methodology and my findings, and I will then conclude and give the floor for discussions and a Q&A session. So in the Netherlands, we've seen across the past years that it has become a consistent site of collective action. An example of this beyond, for example, climate movement would be student encampments and protesting showing solidarity with Palestine for the past 2 years. What I've noticed as a scholar and as a person involved in these movements myself was a lot of different tactics across groups, from encampments to peaceful protesting to petitions, but also a lot of heterogeneity in membership and social identity. And that means not only people from an Arab background participated, but also many Dutch people and European people in general. Concurrently, there has been an increase in scholarly interest in collective action, particularly in repressive context or on repressive topics themselves. As for the literature that guided this research, we obviously begin with the Simca model, which highlights social identity, feelings of anger, and efficacy beliefs as predictors of collective action. But the literature has significantly expanded to include, for example, opinion-based identity, but also feelings of efficacy, whether it be political, identity consolidation efficacy, or how low efficacy can lead to more violent or drastic forms of collective action because people have nothing to lose. Moral conviction and obligation have also been pointed as important predictors of collective action. Having a negative relationship with authority figures, for example, perceiving them as illegitimately repressing certain activists or using illegitimate forms of violence, can also trigger collective action. And risk perceptions are also important predictors. When it comes to repression, repressive forces can directly impact such antecedents and then either promote or demotivate collective action, depending on the context and other factors that interact with it as well. I've noticed several gaps in the literature, and obviously previous scholars have also discussed such gaps. The first one would be the dichotomization of collective action tactics. So tactics are either viewed as normative or non-normative. There has also been, especially in social psychology, a neglect of interpersonal relationships and community. So sociology does tackle the importance of social networks in motivating collective action, but not really social psychology. There has been little attention to activist experience and narratives. This is particularly because of the quantitative surveys that we use. We haven't really talked about how participants themselves experience collective action and how they view these tactics. And finally, there's a lack of interactive view of collective action antecedents. So we don't really know whether participants view them as more interrelated than the literature would suggest. As such, this present study aims to assess how morals and values, relationships with authority figures, opinion-based identity, and a sense of community all interact to influence confrontational collective action engagement. It also extends previous literature by evaluating the factor structure of collective action tactics, which I will discuss in my methodology in a bit. And it also investigates collective action of a repressed cause, which is the Palestine Solidarity Movement, in a fairly democratic context, which is the Netherlands. The significance of this is that it provides a more nuanced understanding of the interrelationship of collective action antecedents and hopefully a more pragmatic understanding of these. It also extends beyond the dichotomous view of collective action. It highlights the role of community in influencing collective action, especially since it has not been really tackled in the literature. It can practically inform social justice movement organizers as to what could work and what could not work, and how to sustain engagement. And it also emphasizes the role of repression and how it can influence engagement across different groups and across different movements as well. For my methodology, I implemented a sequentially exploratory mixed methods approach. So for my first study, I engaged in 12 individual semi-structured interviews. They lasted around 40 to 60 minutes, and I implemented inductive, deductive thematic analysis. This is because there was a lot of literature already present, so I had some predetermined themes and narratives, but I was also open to discovering certain themes as I interviewed participants as well. Based on the literature and the findings of my interview, I also developed a quantitative survey, which I distributed to participants. And I implemented an exploratory factor analysis first to identify the factor structure of different collective action tactics. And then I implemented multiple multivariate linear regression for my main analysis. And all of this was used using R. My final sample was 82, which meant that my study was a little bit underpowered. I had initially 148 participants, but many of them stopped answering questions after the um, like general demographic questions. So I had to delete a lot of things. So my final sample was 82. I collected participants using a purposive snowballing sampling technique. For people to be included in my study, they needed to be 30 years old or younger, and they needed to have participated in a form of collective action in the past year, and it has to have been in the Netherlands as well. I will now go into the findings of my first study, where I found around 4 themes. The first one is the connection between moral obligation, anger, and collective action. So, moral obligation and anger were very closely connected. A lot of people viewed the Palestine solidarity as very repressed in the Netherlands, and they viewed this as illegitimate and unfair. They also viewed how institutions, police systems, governments chose to deal with student activists, particularly, was very unfair, very repressive as well. And that triggered a lot of anger, which triggered a sense of moral obligation to act. Independently of feelings of anger, people felt a moral obligation to act in accordance to their own beliefs and their own moral convictions. So this is one quote that I felt was very representative of this. So Denise, which is a Dutch activist as well, they say that the police system as a whole is a physical form of the thing they're fighting against. It's a system of oppression dominated by white men that is not fair, a system that is okay with seeing innocent people with their hands up getting hammered down with a stick, and it is very unfair. This in response triggered a lot of anger, and it motivated people to engage as well. This quote also relates to my second theme, which is systemic violence relation to collective action. So a lot of people perceived either directly or indirectly feelings of repression, and it's not only immediate, such as getting arrested or getting beaten up, but also this perceived idea of repression in the by fear of losing your status in the country, fear of losing your visa, fear of not getting a passport if you're an international and you want to apply for it, fear of not getting a job in the future. These form of abstract concepts acted as a form of repression that demotivated people from engaging. This was more predominant among non-EU internationals that were more easily discouraged or more afraid. A lot of them also expressed feeling a lot of hopelessness in light of such repression. Nonetheless, especially for some EU individuals, it also encouraged them to participate because of such unfair treatment of people. Again, it's important to note that contextual factors such as people's status, their privilege in the country, could also affect the relationship between violence, repression, and collective action. The third theme, and this was not part of my expectations at all, just people started mentioning a lot and it came up as a theme, is the extension of solidarity across advantaged and disadvantaged group members. Briefly, disadvantaged group members drew a lot of parallels between different forms of oppression, and they viewed a sort of domino effect where if one group was oppressed, this would lead to oppression in another group, and they felt more obligated to act for said groups. Whereas advantaged group members believed that they had to use their privilege and their position in order to speak up against marginalized people. An interesting thing that came up specifically for Dutch individuals was a form of obligation to correct for their ancestors' wrongdoings. They felt like they needed to do better now, and this was the opportunity to do it. Interestingly, there was a complex interaction between multiple identities. So while someone was white presenting, they also belonged to, for example, LGBTQ groups or they were Muslim. So majority and minority groups interacted in complex ways, and that also affected their collective action engagement depending on the cause as well. The final theme is community as a sustenance for collective action. Community was very important to initiate engagement because people started finding out about protests through their friends or through their networks. But then once they came into the protest, they engaged with people who shared the same values, shared the same beliefs, who were also brave enough to engage in these forms of collective action for such a repressed and silenced topic. Practically, it also was very beneficial because it informed people of their rights. It informed people what to do in case they got arrested, in case they saw police in protest. So that also lowered feelings of fear. Um, Participants also experienced feeling a lot of isolation, particularly because they were fighting for such a repressed, marginalized topic. This sense of community helped sustain their hope, sustain their belief in the system, sustain their belief that there could actually be something to be done. And it also helped lower feelings of isolation and loneliness. Community became very important in light of repression, and it also helped counteract the negative effects of repression for Palestine movements. An example of this would be a quote by Ron, an international student activist and organizer, who said that community matters more when you are not the kind of mainstream group in society. It's not like we're protesting for example, tax cuts or something like that. It's not a mainstream accepted idea. So it's definitely a very important group of people for me to be a part of because otherwise you feel very alone. As for my second study, the exploratory factor analysis revealed three forms of categories for collective action tactics. So we have administrative collective action, which is contacting a politician, signing a petition, working in a certain organization or political party group. Disruptive collective action interestingly combines what the classic literature would classify as normative and non-normative collective action. Here we see them in one group. So for example, demonstrating in lawful and unlawful demonstrations, blocking the roads, occupying buildings are all part of disruptive collective action. And confrontational collective action is throwing objects such as rocks and bottles and clashing with the police. As for the main analysis, we see that anger positively relates to disruptive collective action, but no other forms. Feelings of motivation are positively associated with confrontational collective action. A sense of moral obligation, but not conviction, relates to all forms of collective action. Having a negative relationship with authority figures relates to a disruptive and confrontational collective action in a positive way. Risk belief, so perceiving risk in participating in any form of action, interestingly, positively relates to disruptive and confrontational collective action, but seeing these risks as more important negatively relates to disruptive and confrontational collective action, which makes sense. And finally, emotions derived from collective action positively relate to administrative and disruptive collective action. This last variable I added from the interviews. So people felt a lot of positive emotions from participating in collective action and doing something that aligns with their moral beliefs and doing something that they think is good. So I included that in my survey, and it actually does motivate people to engage in collective action. Overall, this shows that collective action antecedents are more interdependently associated and they all work together to motivate collective action. This study also provided a more nuanced view of collective action tactics, particularly because it centers participants' narratives and their own opinions. We can see that repression interacts with risk perception, social identity, status, and moral obligation, and it is very closely related to community because, as I've said before, it makes community more important, but also community helps counteract the negative effects of repression. Importantly, moral obligation and community arose as very important factors that connected all other collective action antecedents. And overall, it's important to note that these findings are constrained within contextual pragmatic factors such as people's time, availability, their status in the country, their jobs, etc. The theoretical implications are that the study tried to bridge macro, meso, and micro level influences of collective action. It expanded beyond the one-dimensional view of identity. So many of the people, as I mentioned in previous slides, were either white LGBTQ or white Muslim, or there were many identities that interacted, and that was very interesting to see in the qualitative part of the study. There was insight into collective action for a repressed topic in a fairly democratic context, and the study highlights the importance of community as a sustenance for long-term collective action as well. Nonetheless, there are a lot of limitations. I had a very small sample size because many of the participants, especially for the survey, they did not trust me. It was very difficult to gain access to such a not paranoid, but people were very scared that I was, for example, a spy or just like not working with them. So it was very difficult to obtain the trust of activists, especially when it comes to Palestine. There was a categorical view of collective actions nonetheless. I wanted to do more of like a spectrum or continuous view, but due to time, sample, and statistical constraints, this was the best I could do. I did not include fear or extent of involvement in the movement as covariates, and they would have been very interesting to see. So future research would benefit from having a more longitudinal study. Person-centered analyses would be very interesting, and to extend the study to other movements. And finally, I believe social psychology should include more community as a predictor variable for different forms of collective action as well. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you really enjoyed this presentation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Samaha. I tried to find this clapping emoji, but I had yeah, yeah. So that was great. Really enjoyed it. So that now the floor is open for questions. Any question from audience? I'm gonna also check the Google Doc to see if there are questions there. Yeah, Steffi, go ahead.
Hi, I'm also struggling with the reactions panel. I couldn't raise my hand. I could clap, but not raise my hand. So thanks a lot for this very nice, very cool research. I have a few questions. So from my research, I also interview like you participants, and I often find that what really motivates them are the positive emotions that you mentioned very briefly at the end. I am curious, did you have a chance to check what particular positive emotions they mention? For example, is it courage to face repressive behavior, or is it hope that the protest or that their disruptive behavior might succeed? So, what types of positive emotions? That was one question. Then another question. regarding the sample size, you said that I can see and I appreciate it's very hard to find people who participate in this. So congratulations on getting those. Um, I'm wondering, why did you restrict yourself to people that are only 30 years old? I wonder if you could get more respondents. If you just lift that barrier, but I don't know how much time you have left. So that was just one question I had. And then thirdly, on the presentation of the context, I wonder, so you say the Netherlands is a democratic context and this is really a repressive topic. That was your categorization. I wonder if that really describes the context adequately over the past 2 years when we saw the right wing really rise, Wilders winning. I visit the Netherlands quite frequently. It's scary that what you see, it doesn't even feel so democratic anymore sometimes. So I wonder if this research doesn't have implications for more repressive settings in general.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. For the first one, the emotions that they named was a lot of feelings of pride that they were doing something that aligned with their own personal values. They felt really good. A lot of them also felt hope and felt energized to see not only that they were engaging, but there was such a big community that um, cared about the same things that they did. A lot of them felt that because they saw these things on their phones or something and they were the only ones who cared before engaging in action, they felt very isolated. But then once they go there, they feel very much connected and they feel hopeful. I think those were the main things. Also, a lot of people said they feel fulfilled. They feel a sense of fulfillment not only in that, but also in doing their moral duty. I think those were the main narratives that came out from what I remember. As for the second question, my original intention was not to keep it to 30 years old or younger, but me and my supervisor, we felt that student activists were more likely to be, especially in the Netherlands, we felt it was more, they were more active and maybe it was more easily accessible. We did not know that it would be the opposite way. So that was a matter of who do we think could be more accessible to us in a short amount of time, and that was it. Um, and the third question, I'm sorry, I forgot it. Can you repeat the third question?
About the specific context of the
Oh, yeah.
Netherlands in the last 2 years.
Yeah, it has been very scary. It also the participants that I interviewed them last year, but they also felt like repressive tactics were getting more and more drastic. For example, a lot more university campuses are now more okay with calling the police and getting their own students arrested than they would have been 2 or 3 years ago. Um, and what we've seen is a lot of people have been silenced or marginalized because they're so scared, particularly international people. But also, there's been a lot of pushback as well from the student activists. There's been a lot of courage to continue to act and not give up. So these people know that this is going to happen, but they don't want to let it discourage them. Um, so I think it's just a testament to their own bravery as well. But the context has been getting more and more repressive, particularly when it comes to Palestine. So I do hope this field of research can continue to grow, not only in the Netherlands as it becomes more repressive, but also in other repressive communities as well. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, great. I'm gonna read one question from the Google Doc. So one was, what were the main movements or collective actions that participants joined in your study?
The main movements that they joined, other than Palestine solidarity, would have been LGBTQ activism, women's rights movements, climate justice. Those were the main ones that appeared. The majority of them still were Palestine solidarity, but it's also important to note that these causes were very much interrelated. So when one person participated in this type of protest, they also participated in the other one. A lot of people had more, there are more anti-fascist protests here in the Netherlands, so they also continue to participate in that as well. So those were the main movements.
Yeah. That's actually interesting because we always talk about like the intersectionality of identities, but now I think there's a growing also research on how there's growing allyship between different movements, that how the membership in one group can also increase the likelihood of joining another group. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was also a question saying that you mentioned intersectional identities, that it was like white LGBTQ plus sort of, intersectional identities. Were there also other intersectional identities that you found in your study?
I found there were others, such as, for example, someone who was non-white, but it was a member of the EU community, so they
Okay.
had a lot of structural privileges, but not very much racial
Mhm.
privileges, so to speak. So they would not be treated as a white person. I also found, uh, I think those were the main ones that I included in my study. I cannot remember many more because I did the study like a while ago, but I think those were the main ones. I'm sure if I look back, I'll check some more out as well.
Yeah, great. I'm also putting me on the list of people who wanted to ask question, but make sure to raise your hand or put some question in the chat if you have questions. I was wondering, you mentioned you used like the hybrid deductive inductive way of coding. And I wonder if you find something in the interviews that we basically don't account for it in the major theories on collective action. I noticed you mentioned the sense of community as being one that comes up a lot in the interviews, but we don't basically reflect a lot on it in the theorizing. Was that all, or were there other codes or other themes that were coming up quite often, and we basically don't talk about it in the theories?
I think the sense of solidarity was not something that the literature tackles much that I included in my results.
Mm,
Sense of community as well. The sense of positive emotions that I briefly mentioned as well. Another interesting one that I found was anger as not only a cause for collective action, but also sort of an effect. So there was this very interesting relationship between anger and collective action engagement that I don't think can be really tackled by the previous literature. So a lot of people stated that while anger can initiate a lot of movement, it does
mhm,
not sustain it on the long term. A lot of people reported feeling more hope or feeling more pride in the movement, and that kept on sustaining them, or more care and love. Those sort of
mm,
positive emotions were the key to sustaining it. Also, anger was more so felt as an effect of engaging in collective action. And I think the literature tackles this briefly, but it was very much prominent in my interviews. So, when people engage in collective actions and they view illegitimate forms of repression, illegitimate violence, or even that despite these large number of protests, nothing seems to change, people feel a lot of anger and a lot of desperation. Um, so I think
mm,
anger was then seen as an effect of collective action, which was very interesting. Another interesting thing that I was not expecting was the feeling of hope, basically. So we do talk about efficacy in the social action literature, collective action literature, but people in my interviews, they did not believe what they were doing had direct short-term effects. So they would not believe that if we protested this year, next year, universities will cut ties with Israeli institutions or whatever their goal
mm,
was, but they had hope that the movements now would keep a long-term legacy of collective action that would lead to slow-term changes and then very big changes in the future. So what sustained and what motivated people was not efficacy, it was more so hope. And I think that was very interesting, and I was not expecting that from the literature.
yeah, great. That's very interesting. Yara, you have a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Samaher. This was really nice. Just two quick disclaimers. I was on the go, so I'm sorry if I say something that shows that I misunderstood. That's on me. And number two, I got kicked out, so I'm sorry if I ask a question that has already been asked. So with these disclaimers, I think I was just interested in was it a sub-theme or a theme of yours that you mentioned where you were talking about how I might butcher this, but you were talking about how these people who are active for Palestine, they started recognizing other disadvantages and started wanting to organize for that as well. And I'm just wondering if you could talk more about that because I just find that so interesting because I feel like it's the whole like none of us are free until Palestine is it's free. I'm wondering if this sentiment of collective liberation is more common now as a reason that people within the West are organizing for Palestine, and I'm just interested in what they had to say about that theme.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So it did come up as a normal um thing. So for these interviewees, their morals and their values were very central to their identity. So if they care about oppression of, let's say, LGBTQ people, they also cared about oppression of the Palestinian people or the people in Sudan, for example. So there was a lot of sense of connection in that. There was also a sense of, oh, if this can happen to, for example, the Palestinian people, what prevents it from happening to my own community or my own people? So there was some sense of that as well, like a domino effect of oppression, as I've said before. That included, that meant that also, so there was an overarching value of, oh, I believe people have the right to love, do, and act and live freely however they want to. So that included Palestine liberation, but then people were also active in organizing for women's rights. And for example, I had one interviewee who was an organizer in Amnesty. She organized for honoring genocide victims. She also developed a lot of petitions for safe abortion procedures for women across Europe. They also participated in Palestine, but also protests for what is happening in Sudan, etc., etc. So there were a lot of common narratives that were drawn, and people then felt the duty that if I'm active for Palestine, I also need to be active for these other people. And relatedly, because you build this sense of community, then those people also care about other things, and then you have a personal obligation to show up. So, for example, many people cared about what is happening in Sudan, and they informed us of certain protests or certain fundraising events, and then we all showed up as a community to show support for said person. So in this way, everything sort of interacted with one another. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you.
Carmen.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned international students earlier, and I was just wondering if you noticed any nuances in the identity, like coming from the identities people had. Like if we're talking about repressive contexts, I can imagine that there are different consequences for of participating in these kind of protests. For instance, like I think we saw that in the US, where you can be threatened to lose your visa, for instance, student's visa, if you participate in certain protests. And I don't know what the situation in the Netherlands there is, but I was wondering how that also showed some differences maybe between participants also. And then I don't know if that's the same, but also if you're a citizen of the Netherlands and witness what your government is doing, whether there are different emotions in terms of anger or disappointment into what your representatives are doing, versus people who are not citizens of the Netherlands can also experience anger, of course, about the situation, but it might be directed at someone else. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There were a lot of nuances when it came to identity. In my quantitative part of the study, I put nationality as a control variable, but it was not significant. But then in the my first study in the interviews, practically there were a lot of things people took into consideration. So international students or people who were working on their visa here, the worst that they participated in was like a lawful demonstration. Anything other than that, they took a step back. Whenever police started to show up, they used to leave. They would not escalate their tactics. Organizers, I interviewed one organizer and they said that when we do this tactically, we put people that are white, that are Dutch, that are European at the front lines when we're interacting with the police, and then international students, people of color, people of other marginalized identities, they go further in the back so that they can either leave quickly or they're protected. So these sort of tactics also go into consideration when you're organizing. People that were non-EU, that were international students, were more afraid of confrontational forms of collective action, such as illegal protesting, occupying buildings, etc. When it comes to the feelings, international students felt a lot of disappointment and a lot of hopelessness in the situation. They also felt very frustrated because oftentimes it only took one interaction with the police for you to just be treated as other. Many people report that, for example, if a police does come and talk to you, they only speak in Dutch, they don't speak in English, or people speak to each other in Dutch, so you don't know what's happening, so you're very confused and you're very scared. Whereas Dutch people, I remember the narrative that came along was they felt a sense of betrayal because they grew up believing the system is there for me, the system will protect me, and the system is good, and I respect the system. But then they grew up and started seeing more forms of marginalization and illegitimate forms of repression, and they felt like this reality shatter, sort of. And the more that they grew up, and once they started seeing that, they kept on seeing that, and they could not unsee it. So they felt a lot of disappointment, a lot of shame in what their representatives were doing, a lot of distrust. So a lot of people said, I no longer feel represented by my own people and by my own government elected officials. So, and many of them felt, again, a sense of duty to correct for their ancestors' history of colonization and racism and oppression. They felt like, oh, it's my duty to correct for that as well. So they were living with a long-term legacy of oppression that they felt they needed to correct, and then they also felt very disappointed in the current state of affairs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions?
I had a question.
Yep.
So thank you so much for your talk. I think it was really interesting and so important to be able to capture mixed methods approaches. So it was great to hear from someone who's doing this. My question relates to the feelings of community, because this is an outcome that I'm interested in outside of resistance more generally. I think community belonging is something that we intuitively understand as important, especially in contexts of repression, but also oppression generally speaking. And I was wondering how you would imagine operationalizing. I think someone else has also mentioned this in the questions as well, but how do we measure this sense of community belonging, and where does it come up, and how would we use that as a predictor for different models? But yeah, if you could speak more on that, I'd be very interested.
From my personal experience, what I did, and because I had very limited experience with operationalizing community, as you've said, what I did was try to take things from the interview and put them on the survey, but I also used feelings of belonging and social identity, and I sort of adapted those surveys and instruments to a sense of community. So what I would say is feelings of feeling safe within that particular space, feelings that you share certain values and beliefs. That was something that came up as important in the community. Feelings of I feel like I belong to that community. I feel like I am proud to be part of that community. Those were things that were present there. I'm trying to think of more things that came up as important. What I also think is the importance of a shared either space or cause or morals that they like, irrespective of maybe, because a lot of people also said that there was an online community if they cared about the same thing, but it was emphasized with protesting. So I feel like something in common that they all share. But I'm more interested to see how we can take it and operationalize it in the future because there has been so little to quantitatively and qualitatively study this in the field of social psychology. So I think it will be very interesting to see in the future as well, beyond what I've found in this paper.
If I can follow up, so my work currently, I'm looking at feelings of belonging in LGBTQ individuals, and there has been some operationalization of this. I'd be happy to share a paper that I think could be helpful in maybe expanding the measures that they use specifically. So they measure like feelings of belonging to the New York City queer community. And some of the things that they measure are quite similar to what you say with, pride in the community, feeling safe, feeling that you share those values. So I will share that in the communal note-taking doc.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. A related question on that one. So you also developed a measurement of collective action yourself, and you had like three different dimensions, like administrative, confrontational, and disruptive. And did you develop the items from the interviews, or were you just sort of assembled all the items from the established measurements?
The tactics themselves, they were from previous literature that included such tactics, and also from the forms of action that I saw people were most likely to engage in the
Okay.
Netherlands as well. But then the factor structure was something that I developed based on the EFA results.
Yeah.
But it was based on previous literature, yes.
Yeah. But that's actually what was very interesting, because sometimes people also conflate political participation with collective action, and I really like that how you basically differentiate like the one that is about participation or administrative, and then what from the one that a little bit more agentic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Is there any other remark, comment, feedback? I think we're almost running out of time, but there's time for one question. Yeah.
Maybe
Friederike?
one more. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Friederike. Thank you, Samaher, very much. I was wondering to continue on with the conversation about community and community building, because often that happens also in this kind of in-between spaces, in really this everyday actions. If that came up at all during the interviews, if there were mentions of maybe not like calling somebody, but the kind of in-between care practices that are happening, or these kind of forms of everyday collective actions that might also contribute to community building.
Yes, they sort of came up sometimes in the interviews, especially so many of the participants I interviewed engaged in the encampment movements that happened in the Netherlands, which meant that there wasn't always a form of direct action, but there were just people staying there. And during that period, people were always checking up on each other, asking how one was. If one felt very tired or wanted to go home, then the other one would step in and be like, "It's okay, I can take care of this for now, you go." Many people say that it provided help with studying, with mental health support as well. There was a lot of bonding that happened. For organizers as well, they always have some sort of aftercare, or they call it radical care communities, where you check up on people always, you maintain a form of contact every day so that these people still can feel connected and feel like the movement is still very much like an active bonding community sort of space. So I think those were the main things that emerged in this study. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I guess that's the session for today. Thanks, Samaher Yehya, for presenting a very interesting study. Really enjoyed it. And from the interest in the Google Doc and from the questions, I also see that everybody was very engaged and interested and enjoyed. So thanks a lot. So we have basically monthly meetings. We are meeting every second Monday of the month, and we have meetings planned until June. So feel free to check the schedule, and you'll hear from us when we have the sessions ready and send around the link for registration. So great to have you all, and thanks for joining, and have a great rest of Monday.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.